So several Just Stop Oil protesters were arrested the other day as more people are getting fed up. Are the protests totally okay and we should just not do anything about it? Or should we have harsher protests and stop Just Stop Oil?
Yeah, I mean, the government has brought in now some laws which are making it easier, and the police, in fact, in London have shown
they have arrested once or twice. But should they be more harsh, or is this okay?
I'm not that interested in the arrests. I don't care whether they end up in prison or not. What interests me is that they break up the protests and allow people to get to the airport who've got holidays booked, people to get to hospital appointments, people to get to work, ambulance drivers to get to sick patients, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, even yesterday I read that these Just Oil or whatever disturbed the first night of the proms. You know, and they've been disrupting sports events, putting their own lives and others at risk at some, you know, on some occasions, for example, the Grand National, etc. So yes, I do support. Again, like I said before, I'm all for free speech. I'm all for the right to protest, but you know, ordinary people have rights as well, and they can't just block motorways. And
so you're saying that you think there should be harsher protest laws?
Yes, yeah.
What do you think?
I think that the Tory legislation against protesting is anti-democratic. I think to be arrested because you're too noisy, I think because you're protesting is a way of clamping down on free speech. And I think that's completely wrong. And that was brought in not because of Stop Oil, but because people who were demonstrating in Parliament Square. So that against things that the Tories didn't like to listen to hear about. So I think that the laws that have been brought in by the Tories, I think, are just completely unnecessary, anti-democratic, clamping down on protest and views against their own policies. And I don't agree with them. Stop Oil. My issue, I've got two views on that in a way. One is, if people want to protest, then I think there's no point in protesting and trying to get your message across if you're not going to inconvenience people. I mean, I remember Peter Hain, for example, was part of digging up, I think it was Headingley or Lords test pitch in the 1970s. Headingley in the 1970s, as part of the anti-apartheid movement and protests. Of course, it was inconvenient, but on the other hand, it raised the profile of the anti-apartheid movement as probably a clever thing to do. So Stop Oil, I think if they want to protest, they chain themselves to a goalpost post at Goodison Park, I think last season, holding the game up for 5 minutes. I think people are entitled to do that. You know, they're not hurting anyone. My issue is I'm not clear what their aims are. I mean, that's my issue in a way. I think if organisations and people want to protest in that way, traditionally, we have got our rights by protest. Women have got their rights by protesting, even breaking the law, and the anti-apartheid movement, for example. So there are issues like that. So I couldn't say I could agree with it when it suits me, my political point of view, and disagree with it when it doesn't. My issue is I'm not really clear on what they want.
So it really just depends on what they want. And
Well, first of all, if I can be a bit controversial, because you like controversy, it's good for the
it's halachic,
the numbers.
Isn't
it? Yeah. The Labour Party have got to get their act together and with regard to this, because they've taken £1.5 million from Vince Dale, I think his name is, who supports these.
The founder of Just Oil.
The founder of Just Oil, or certainly the supporter. Yeah. Keir Starmer has said that they called them arrogant and told them to stop. So I think they need to get the policies on this a bit more together. Let me tell you, I'm going to get this in.
I'd agree with you on that, by the way.
Okay. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at a garden party at 10 Downing Street. Got to get that in. And you know what? You could hardly hear yourself talk. You really couldn't. There was people outside on the other side of the garden. Don't know where that leads to, the mall or horse cars or whatever. And there was people playing music and all sorts of things, clearly to drown out what was going on number 10. And then when I came out onto Whitehall, there was several people with flags and protests not disturbing anyone, not stopping the traffic, not stopping people. And I went over to one of them because I wanted to hail a taxi coming back, and one of them had a free Julian Assange flag, and there was all sorts of. And we're very rightly proud of that in this country. And outside Parliament, that anti-Brexit guy's been outside Parliament for many, many days. And there was a woman who shouted at me. She said, "Have you been jabbed for COVID?" I said, "Yes, I have, several times." She said, "Are you aware that you are part of a global
5G,
global experiment and all that?" And I just sort of engaged, and that's fine. That's part, as we've said, that's part of our culture. I have no problem with that, as long as she didn't stop me getting into Downing Street or out of Downing Street, which she didn't. She and the police don't have a problem.
So
with that.
if they would do that, should that be stopped?
No, if they're not causing any problems, just making a protest. That I don't have a problem with that.
I mean, I think we can't just rule out protest because it's inconvenient to us. I mean, that's the most effective form of protest, to create inconvenience. Otherwise, who will listen? And I think the other thing is, if people within inside 10 Downing Street could hear people outside the gates shouting and campaigning, I'm pleased to hear that, because I would hate to think that they're insulated from hearing of protest. I've been in council meetings in Liverpool where people have been demonstrating outside and shouting, playing music, against policies that we've got and we've had. So and it's inconvenient, and and it gets in the way a little bit. But I would never say they haven't got the right to do that.
No, I would agree. And by the way, the Just Stop Oil,
you just said that.
tried to infiltrate Lords. They were one that, if you're a cricket fan, you'll know what it.
No,
but you'll know the difference between
don't you think there's that difference?
Ruining the square and ruining the outfield, and it was only a Yorkshireman, I think it's his son. Is he called anyway? Johnny Bairstow? Johnny Bairstow, who literally picked the guy up, manhandled him and took him off, much to the.
Don't you think there's a difference between, like what Barry said, when you feel it's inconvenient for you, when they're blocking your way, does that mean just because it's inconvenient? Why does that mean it should be banned?
Well, let me tell you what happened at Headingley and what was nearly happened at Lords is criminal damage. That's not just protesting. Lords and Headingley are a privately owned ground.
No, we're talking about Just Stop Oil.
Both.
I'm talking about Just Stop Oil here, when they're stopping people from getting past.
Yeah, but because I'm just saying what they were trying to do at Lords. Lords is owned by the MCC. They were trespassing on the pitch, which is illegal. In a football match, you'd end up in prison just for stepping on the pitch. It was an illegal trespass, and that nobody should have the right to protest. And it was more than protest. They wanted to damage the square and have the game called off. I would have got them wonderful publicity, absolutely wonderful publicity. But it's not right and it's illegal. Protesting in the streets, which, yes, you're right, is generally legal. But I do feel the government were right to bring in other, because they have to think of people as well. If they did it just once and it was pre-planned and there was diversion signs and what have you, that maybe you could have.
So what's the limit? Isn't the limit? Well, you're deciding the limit, aren't you?
Well,
the difference is with Barry. So he's saying, I'm not saying who's right, but the difference is with Barry. He's saying at least I can't decide the limit. You're saying I don't know where the limit is. Therefore, we should just allow people to do it, even if it's inconvenient for me.
So you would be happy to?
I'm not being happy. I'm just asking you.
Happy to have these people blocking motorways, stopping people getting to.
You tell me, Barry. Would you be happy?
No. Every single day of the week, and they'd be untouchable. I'm sorry.
No, I'd be
sorry. I can't. I'm sorry. That's just.
I'd be totally unhappy about it, but I wouldn't mean that I would want them to take away the right to do it. I mean, if people protest and are breaking the law at the same time, then they know what the consequences are. That's up to them to take the consequences. And where there are issues which I support, like anti-apartheid, I admire that. Sometimes it's when there are issues which I'm not in agreement with, but I don't necessarily admire them because I don't agree with what they're doing. But I can't say it's wrong. I can't make the distinction morally between one and the other. And the other thing I would say is, the Tories didn't bring in, and I don't think you would think this, or do you, that the Tories brought in their legislation to clamp down on protesting because they wanted to support other people? I think it's because they didn't want to hear people campaign against Brexit outside the House of Parliament.
Well, they left it for several years. They left that.
They got round to it.
They eventually got around to it. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. And I'll just say about apartheid, unfortunately.
As a last point, should we finish off now? Or?
Yeah,
No problem.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to carry on with Barry, by all
No, sure.
I'm just going to make this last point. Very controversial point. I was against apartheid as much as you were. But surely you can't honestly believe that apartheid ended because they dug up the pitch in Headingley. I can't.
Not one act against the anti-apartheid regime contributed to the fall of apartheid, but collectively a whole number of acts, including raising the public profile and the awareness of the issue, of course did, and that was one of them. So I would have sat, and I remember it, I'm sure you do, so I think it
well,
so
Ellie won't, probably wasn't
born.
Yeah.
So I think
but if you'd bought a ticket and you'd taken a day off work and you'd travelled some distance to get to Headingley, as we both would have done had we been there.
No, but the difference is you're saying it's got nothing to do with inconvenience.
Maybe you'd been entertaining around. You wouldn't.
The whole point is Barry's saying it's got nothing to do about him being inconvenient. Just because it's inconvenient for him doesn't mean it should be banned.
Because you could use that same argument to ban strikes.
Well, let's not talk about that.
If the bar is convenience, then you're barring strikes, aren't you?
Well, that's a completely separate subject, strikes. I think the government are getting on top of some of these strikes. Certainly the army, the police and others are not able to strike. And some unions are making anti-strike agreements, with in return for sort of impartial adjudication, etc.
No, they're not.
So I think there are ways of of avoiding strikes, but that's for another.
That's a separate point. But just on the point of this, just to complete it, you think that there should be harsher laws, and you think not only should there not be harsher laws, you think we should go back down and make protesting easier.
You're right. Yes, I do think. I stress again. I don't care whether they go to prison or not.
I just think it should stop.
I think there should be powers to stop it. I'm not interested if they end up in prison or not. I mean, that obviously would be a deterrent, but it could also make them martyrs. But I'm not interested in that. I just want to make sure that the police clear the roads.
Okay, so just
to finish off,
at least people
we need to finish off. So this
do their own thing. Yeah,
I think so. So I think what you're saying is contradictory and confusing, because there are already laws around trespass that you mentioned, around antisocial behaviour or blocking the roads off. Those laws are already in existence. The rules that have been brought in by the Tories aren't about that. So they're about noise levels and trying to limit more and more protests. So I think that the legislation that's been brought in should be repealed. I think the Labour Party should commit to repeal it, and I think people, if they have something that they feel that's important for them to protest against, then they should do the protest. If it's not legal, then they're aware of consequences, they can take them. But we shouldn't be bringing in any more laws that make it any more difficult for people to protest than it is already.
Well, can I just say one final thing? I really have to go.
You just want the last word, don't you?
I'm no expert on the law, right? I'm no expert, but what I can tell you is whatever the laws there were till now, the police weren't using them. So, why they weren't using them, I don't know. So now they are starting to use the new laws. And let me say this: you want to give Barry the final word? I'm happy. if anybody or the BBC want to pick up this podcast, or the national press, or even the Tory and Labour parties, I think if you want to see the difference between the Conservatives and the Labour, and particularly going into by-elections and the next election, I think anybody just has to listen or watch this podcast, and I think you'd get a very good idea. So I hope it does very well.
Well, if I could have the final word, then I would say if people want to make a choice between whether they want to vote Conservative or Labour or not, they just need to watch what is going on nationally, where Prime Minister can't even be bothered to turn up to Parliament to vote to sanction a former Prime Minister who clearly broke privilege, the law. And the double standards and the hypocrisy of the Tory Party. So and people are making that choice, I don't need to tell them.
Can I come in there? I wasn't intending to have the last word. I actually heard Rishi defend himself on that recently, and his defence, I don't know if you've heard this, was that he was a
busy,
guest of honour at the Jewish Care dinner. No,
Yeah.
seriously.
No,
at the
I know,
Jewish
but
Care dinner.
No, but even I'm not particularly a supporter for either party, but even I know that.
Yeah,
that's
West
not
Streeting
true. He
went to
could've-
the same
yeah,
thing.
But
he-
West Streeting wasn't the guest speaker.
No, but he could have made it work.
But
He
West
could have made it-
Streeting did give a view on whether he thought that Johnson should have been banned from Parliament for 90 days. Rishi Sunak didn't. Didn't have to attend anywhere to say that. He never said it.
Well, if he's not going to vote anyway...
I think we're getting too distracted.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for coming on, Barry. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you, Barry.
Nice to meet you.